I will now call this meeting to order. Our first order of business is to adopt the agenda for tonight's meeting. Commissioners, is there a motion to adopt the agenda?
I'd like to motion to adopt the agenda.
Is there a second?
I will second.
Thank you. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. The motion carries. Our next order of business is to adopt the minutes from the September 7th, 2021 Planning Commission meeting. Commissioners, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Excellent. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Thank you. The motion does carry. We are now moving on to our discussion items. And we have one discussion item on our agenda tonight, and it is item 3.1, residential zoning districts discussion. This is a continuation of our ongoing conversation on Victoria's residential district ordinances and is for discussion purposes only. I will now turn it over to Community and Economic Development Director Marty Dole for a staff presentation. Marty?
Thank you, Chair, members of the commission. Yes, as Chair Iverson noted, this is the second part of our review of the city's residential districts. As you'll recall, we reviewed the R1 and R2 standards at our last meeting. This evening, we are going to be looking at the R3 and R4 zoning district uses and standards. You will see the PowerPoint template is very similar to the way we presented the information 2 weeks ago. So with that, I think we'll just jump right into it. So our R3 district is considered a multi-unit residential district. There are limited number of parcels that are zoned R3 within the city currently. This R3 district does allow for a little bit higher density of uses, so it does not allow single-family homes as a permitted use, but does allow townhomes, semi-detached townhomes, multifamily dwellings, as well as some of the other permitted uses you've seen in our other residential districts, such as municipal facilities, utility services, and places of worship. Permitted accessory uses in the R3 district are also comparable to those of other residential zoning districts, but with a little bit of a nuance to them because these are more geared toward multifamily units. So R3 does allow detached garages in common buildings. So the thought is that those garages would be connected for some of those users. It allows swimming pools, tennis courts, and other recreational facilities that are used by homeowner associations and similar organizations. It allows for storage buildings for common use of the members of the HOA or similar organizations or for use by maintenance staff. Does allow home occupations, daycare centers, solar collectors, docks, and patios and detached decks as well for accessory uses. Conditional uses in the R3 district, the only conditional use listed is the commercial use antenna towers upon existing city-owned buildings or structures. Again, that is similar language that's seen across all of the residential zoning districts. And then moving into R4, our R4 district is a high-density zoning district. There are currently no parcels zoned as R4 within the city. We do obviously have some higher density apartment complexes, but those are either in our commercial business or central business district or have been developed through PUD and other zoning districts. But we do not, as I mentioned, have any R4 zoned properties currently. This does allow for townhomes or row homes, multifamily dwelling units, municipal facilities, utility services, as well as places of worship. Permitted accessory uses are in the R3 district with detached garages in a common space, recreational facilities that are used by members of an HOA, storage buildings for use by members or by maintenance staff, daycare centers, home occupations, solar collectors, docks, and patios or detached decks. Conditional uses, again, the antenna towers on existing city-owned buildings are a conditional use in this zoning district, as well as buildings with greater than the maximum allowed number of attached homes. There is a max number within the code of how many units can be within a structure in this zoning district, and it's spelled out that a conditional use can be provided to exceed that. So moving into the bulk regulations for these different uses, excuse me. In the R3 district, again, as we mentioned, the principal uses are semi-detached, townhome, or multifamily. The semi-detached could be considered like a row home or even some single-family villa-type products. You'll see these lot dimensions are quite a bit smaller than what we would see in our traditional single-family areas. So the semi-detached homes have a minimum lot area of 3,750 square feet, 40-foot width, 75-foot depth, 25-foot front and rear yard setbacks, either from the right-of-way or the back of curb from a private drive. Side yard setbacks between these buildings of 5 feet each, a maximum impervious surface of 75%, a max height of 35 feet, and a minimum floor area of 1,200 square feet. Moving on to townhomes, and again, this is per unit, not per building when it comes to the lot area width and depth. Those are minimum area of 1,100 square feet, 20 feet of width, 55 feet of depth, similar 25-foot front and rear yard setbacks. The side yard setbacks for townhomes in this district is 15 feet of building separation. Impervious surface is 75% for the building on its lot and 55% development wide. Max height of 35 feet and a minimum floor area of 1,000 square feet. And then multifamily is also allowed, apartment type complexes in R3. Those have a minimum lot area of 25,000 square feet, 100-foot width, 125-foot depth. The front yard setback increases to 30 with a rear yard setback of 35 feet. These also have 15-foot building separations, and then the same 75% building and 55% development-wide maximum impervious surface coverage. These facilities can be up to 45 feet high in R3, and there is not a listed minimum floor area in the code. So some of our other uses, again, this table will look pretty comparable to those we reviewed at our last meeting in the R1 and R2 districts. One of the things that staff noted in those districts, and it is applicable in this area too, is that there's some inconsistencies as what is listed as principal uses in the list within the code and what's noted in the bulk regulations for principal use. So that's going to be one of the things we're going to want to look at cleaning up as part of this process. But this does include, as you'll note, far more principal uses in the bulk regulations than were listed in the previous slide. But the front yard and rear yard setbacks, side yard setbacks, impervious surface, and max heights are fairly comparable to those in the R1 and R2. Heights are about 10 feet higher in R3, matching what the max height on a multi-unit building can be. And then this does have the odd 35-foot each side yard setback that we'll want to talk about when we start digging into these further. Accessory uses, again, also very comparable to what we saw in the R1 and R2 districts, primarily 45-foot front yard setbacks except for temporary construction buildings, 10-foot rear yard setbacks, the 6-foot side yard setback except for patio or detached deck, and then varying max heights as well. So moving into R4 bulk regulations, again, this is similar to R3 except for that it does not allow any semi-detached type housing product in these zoning districts. The townhome bulk regulations are comparable to what is the regulations in the R3 district with 1,100 square feet, 20-foot width, 55-foot depth, the 25-foot front and rear yard setbacks, 15-foot building separation, 75 and 55 for impervious surface, 35-foot maximum height, and a minimum floor area of 1,000 square feet. And then in the R4 zoning district, the multifamily apartment type complexes are a little bit larger than what we saw in the R3 district with a minimum lot area of 1 acre, minimum lot width of 200 feet and a lot depth of 200 feet, 30-foot front yard, 35-foot rear yard setback, 20 feet of building separation, 75 and 55 impervious surface. Max heights are also a little bit larger at 55 feet in this district, and as was the case in R3, a minimum floor area is not noted. In the R4 district, there are only 2 listed other principal uses within the bulk regulations table: worship and assembly and municipal facility. Again, these are comparable to the R3 district, with the exception of the max height is increased to match that maximum height of a multi-unit facility. And then accessory uses, again, just some of the inconsistencies. You'll note the side yard setbacks in this area are noted as 5 feet each side for all of those accessory uses, but otherwise the other regulations are comparable, although I think there is some discrepancy in the max heights as well between the two. So those are some of the minutia that we'll need to clean up as we clean up these codes. And then moving on, just to give you a sample of some of the PUDs that have been approved related to townhomes in the last 4 or 5 years. We have had a few of them, and you can see how they compare to what those minimum lot width and depth areas that have been called out in the R3 and R4 district. Currently, the Rolling Hill South project, which is in preliminary plat, has a minimum lot area of 1,125 square feet, 25 feet of width, 45 of depth, 20-foot front yard setback from the private drive, rear yard setbacks of 25 feet from the right-of-way or 30 feet building separation, side yard setbacks of either 15 feet from right-of-way or 20 feet building separation, and an impervious surface for the buildings themselves of 95%. Laketown 15th, which was approved a couple of years ago and is under construction currently, they had a minimum lot area of 1,856 square feet, a little bit wider and longer lots, 32 feet and 58 feet. 15-foot front yard setbacks. These are all off of private drives, this development, and 15 feet of building separation, as well as a 15-foot building separation for side yard setbacks and a 75% max impervious surface for the building. Laketown 13th, which is in the same area as the 15th edition, was also townhome development. These were approved a little bit smaller than the 15th, 1,100 square feet, minimum lot area, 20-foot width, 55-foot depth, but some larger setbacks, 25 feet front and rear, and then 15 feet of building separation for side yard setbacks, and a 55% maximum impervious surface coverage. Whispering Hills is another recent townhome development. Those are coming in at 1,440 square feet for minimum lot area, 24 feet width, 60-foot depth. Front yard setbacks vary based on the right-of-way that they are fronting, between 15 and 20. And then side yards, there's at least 30 feet of building separation. These also, these had a 90% maximum impervious surface coverage. And then lastly, the Reservon Park is the last duplex development that was approved by the city about 4 or 5 years ago. And this one had, because it was a duplex lot, a little bit larger area, 2,900 square feet, 39 feet wide, 77 feet depth. 20 and 30-foot front yard setbacks depending on the frontage, 35 feet from the development or property boundary as a rear yard setback, 10 feet of building separation, and 77% impervious surface coverage. So you can see, similar to the R1 and R2 districts and the approved PUDs over the last 5 years, varying in most of these cases depending on the property and the proposal by the applicant at the time. And so a couple of just the initial observations that staff have made related to these 2 zoning districts. Some of these are the same observations as our R1 and R2 districts. The first being the broad question of, are the current permitted accessory and conditional uses adequate and accurate for these types of zoning districts? Are the bulk regulations for all of those uses adequate? A note that, as I mentioned earlier, there are currently no R4 parcels in the city of Victoria, and there's only a limited number of R3 parcels, but did want to note that the 2040 comprehensive plan does guide some future land use areas for medium density and high density residential, which would likely take advantage of these or comparable zoning districts in the future. Just to note that the central business district also allows multi-dwelling units as a conditional use. So that is another quasi-residential district that we'll talk about in a future meeting. And then again, the point of there are a lot of inconsistencies in our bulk regulations that need to be updated, specifically in the R3 district, which includes a number of permitted uses in the table, but that are not listed as permitted uses. So we'll need to clarify what we think should be and should not be permitted uses and get that cleaned up. And then similar to the other residential districts, home occupations are noted as a permitted use, but they are not currently defined within our code. And with that, Chair, that concludes staff presentation. As with our previous meeting, we're looking for any initial observations, any additional information that the commission would like to see brought forward related to these districts, some questions that we may not have the answer for tonight, but can note to bring forward, and we'll continue to compile those, and we'll have some in-depth discussion on these items as we get through all the background.
Superb. Thank you very much, Marty. Yeah. I will now open the floor for discussion on these issues.
Just one quick topic, Marty. We talk about permitted uses. Do we have any restrictions in these residential areas? And are they, if we do have restrictions, are they buried somewhere else in some other ordinances? And would it be maybe beneficial to bring those restrictions and bring them into the ordinance of permitted uses, permitted restrictions, clean, no, you have to go here to find this and find that?
We do have some other areas of the code that can impact a use in a zoning district. So right now, the way the code is set up, the code sets up what the lot regulations are, so it will establish that lot size and those setbacks. But then there's additional regulations related to accessory structures that's included in the code. There's a chapter on accessory structures. As the commission knows, things like the shoreland ordinance can come into play depending on where that property is located. So part of our process as staff, similar to when we looked at the shoreland ordinance, will be to what other parts of the code are being impacted or potentially would need to be changed, or are we going to create an inconsistency if we change this section and don't change this? And then we'll have to determine, does it make sense to pull those all into the same chapter? At minimum, we want to reference code sections and chapters. So when we're talking about accessory uses, there's a quick link in the code that'll click you right over to it. But that'll be part of staff's ongoing work into this issue too, is digging into some of those other code sections and finding those things, just as you mentioned.
Okay. And then lastly, the table that you have about the bulk uses,
Which one?
with semi-detached townhome, multifamily with 3,750 square foot for the minimum lot size. Is it?
Page 10 of 15?
It's on page 10. Okay, our table on page 10, you have minimum lot depth twice, but here you've got width and depth.
Yeah, I think that was likely a typo in the background packet. Apologies.
So one of the issues that came up a couple years ago was auto repair, and there was a individual specifically that had quite a large collection of vehicles. Do we have regulations which kind of follows up on Greg in terms of do we have something defined?
Chair, members of the commission, we do not, and that's one of the things staff has observed multiple times in this code, is we do not have good definition for home occupation. So when we're talking about what is or isn't permitted, as far as home businesses in these residential areas, there's no definition in the code. The code, and part of me thinks there may have been at one point in time, because the code in the residential districts note home occupations as defined by code. And we've looked, we've searched, we've combed, there's no definition in the code for home occupation. So that's certainly, and I know Isaac's actually started doing some comparisons and pulling some information and trying to start crafting some potential language on home occupations to try to address some of those issues, because home occupations can vary. You could be an entrepreneur who works just in your basement office from home, or you could have an auto service type industry that's far more impactful. So there certainly needs to be some regulations related to what, and definition of what constitutes a home occupation that can be conducted in a residential district.
One of the other topics, of course, once you open up a topic, there's all sorts of subtitles. But one of the other ones that came up was oversized vehicles, delivery vans or that type of thing. And I've heard, just recently again, that's become an issue. And I guess if we can be in the preventative mode, that's a nice place to be. So.
Yeah, Chair, members of the commission, we do have code language related to parking of RVs and oversized vehicles. I can't recall exactly what the regulations and restrictions are off the top of my head. I know that RVs are only supposed to be parked seasonally, so for a maximum of 6 months out of the year. And I believe that if a oversized vehicle, which is defined by certain size and dimension, is to be parked, I think it's supposed to, by code, get a oversized vehicle parking permit that restricts the time and area and where it can be parked and how long. But I haven't looked at that specific code section in a while, so I don't have all of it at the tip of my tongue right now.
So, and one other issue, so max height 45 feet. Would that essentially be a 4-story for an apartment building?
Yeah, Chair, members of the commission, I believe that's accurate, that 45 feet would get you to about 4 stories. 45 feet is the max height in the R3 district as currently written, but as you'll recall in the R4 district, which we have none of, 55 feet is the maximum height. So certainly that's one of the items that we'll want to talk about. Are those the right numbers for these types of products and uses in zoning districts?
Mm-hmm. I also wonder, and maybe it's in a different part of code, if we have parking guidelines to go along with these multifamily developments, because I think that's one of the things that always comes up. How many parking spaces per bedroom or per dwelling unit? And I know it came up with the townhomes where they were kind of under parking, and I think we should maybe think about adding some guidelines for those more multi-uses.
Yes, members of the commission, we do have parking guidelines for a multitude of uses that are applicable to all of our zoning districts, residential included. So there are some guidelines that state what the minimum number of parking spaces are. Even our single family homes, we have a requirement of how much parking needs to be available, but that's certainly something we can make sure we bring forward so we can look and make sure it's accurate. Typically or historically, recently, we've been dealing with those types of things under the commercial business district parking regulations, which are a little different than anywhere else. There's some reductions that are allowed based on shared parking. But as we look at growing in our growth area and introducing some of these types of products in different areas that are separate from the commercial business district, I think that's something we'll want to make sure we look at.
Especially if there's some cross easements happening with commercial properties beside.
So for the point of reference, how many feet is 55 feet in a building? So the warehouse space over by Mills Fleet Farm, are you familiar with that, Marty? Mm-hmm. What would be the height of a building like that?
Oh, gosh, you're putting me on the spot. I don't know the answer.
It would seem over 55, wouldn't it?
Do you have any idea?
Chair, members of the commission, I'm not sure how tall that particular building is. I would say that a story is generally 14 feet. So when we're looking at our R3 and R4 zoning district, that 45-foot figure is about 3 stories, just for some added reference.
So there will certainly be issues that will come up in the future that will have to take another look, I would think, at the maximum height. You know, when I look at, you know, some of the churches that are going up, that's some pretty tall structures too.
Chair, members of the commission, that's another note I made to myself here too, is we can provide some buildings for context as well. Just so I myself am a visual person, so being able to say, okay, that building is that high helps to contextualize that, so.
I have a few things I just want to ask. So on the R4 district uses, accessory uses, detached garages in a common building. I'm starting to have some concern with this because I think about our higher density and our medium density areas. And if these are to be dense areas, do we want detached garages? My thought is we don't, because we want to create density, right? So the garage should be under the dwelling.
Commissioner Moore, I think that's a valid point, something we should talk about.
And then can we elaborate a little bit on recreational facilities as a R3 use?
Yeah, Commissioner Moore, members of the commission, that is also a very vague, poorly defined, I think, use. And it really depends on where you're seeing that. And we've come across that there's sometimes those are listed as accessory uses, sometimes those are listed as principal uses. To our interpretation, the best examples of that would be when it's a principal use. It would be like a clubhouse facility, like the recent Hunters Brook development. We would use the principal use, bulk regulations, something like a standalone HOA swimming pool, or, you know, if they had a tennis court or a basketball court somewhere, or those types of uses that are a little more independent, we would likely look at the accessory bulk regulations, because they do differ slightly. But it's pretty loosely defined.
Mm-hmm. It would, yeah, a little bit more definition would be great. I mean, obviously, I think that's the intent, what you stated, but, you know, operators need to know that they can't build a 15,000 square foot gym in a residential district.
We've also, and again, this is likely just something that's happened with the code being moved around and changed over the years, but every other residential district has not applicable for a max height of a recreation facility, except for R4 has 14 feet. So those are things we need to figure out. What is the use, and is there a height applicable, and let's make those consistent.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question. So on the townhouse, it says the minimum lot area for a townhouse in R3 is 1,100 square feet. Walk me through this, because I might be interpreting this wrong. Could a developer buy literally 1,100 square feet and build on that? I mean, that says minimum lot area. So could they just build one?
Commissioner Moore, I believe our interpretation of that would be that if it's a single unit, it is not a townhome. So it would not fall under that townhome definition, because I think townhome is defined as connected Is that accurate?
Yes, that's correct. It would have to be attached to something.
And do we have a minimum unit count that's required?
Maybe 2.
Commissioner Moore, Chair, members of the commission, would be 3 or more.
Okay, and we have that language existing, okay. I think that's all I have.
It's just one question for everybody. On page 9 of our packet, in R3 conditional uses, there is commercial use of antenna towers on existing city-owned buildings or structures. Is this a placeholder so that the city can cover the cell tower antennas that are like on the water towers and things like that?
Yes, Commissioner Vansky, members of the commission, that is my understanding, is that this was included as a conditional use just to essentially, grandfather in potentially any of those existing uses that were in place in 2017 when this code was last thoroughly revised, and then to provide an opportunity for the city to be able to do that if there are future water towers or future public facilities in those areas, although the language does say existing, so a new facility probably wouldn't fall into that category.
Well, would it be something we'd want to discourage or allow if we had a reasonable sized apartment complex that it was a little bit far out, to allow the owners of the building to put up cell tower antennas in a would we want that, restrict that, or allow it subject to certain conditions, like they can't be visible, blah, blah, blah?
Commissioner Vansky, members of the commission, I do believe we have some code language that is related to how and where and what these antennas can be attached to. And I think the idea behind that is you don't necessarily just want these big standalone towers in the middle of a residential facility, but that you could allow them to be attached to some of these buildings. But you are correct, the way this language is written right now, it wouldn't necessarily be considered a allowable conditional use because it's not included. So I think that's certainly something that we should talk about as part of this as well.
Okay, great. Thanks.
In looking at a whole variety of other outlying areas, I mean, you can go all the way to, Montemedi, for example, or you can go to Young America, on opposite ends of the city and kind of, more semi-rural than anything else, is the auxiliary buildings that are put up for some very, very nice buildings. At the same time, steel structures that are used for shop or storage or whatever it may be. And it looks like that's a structure that could really get out of hand very, very easily. And, certainly has, previous meeting, we dealt with a very, very nice looking building. But it was, pretty much out of place for what is now a residential area and, grandfathered in at the same time. So anything preventative on that, I've seen some, I brought up Montemedi in particular, and have seen some very, very, very nice buildings with very, very nice homes, but they'll be surrounded by, single family or townhouse developments very, very shortly too, and then, that's kind of after the fact, so.
Yeah, Commissioner Iverson, members of the commission, and I might punt this over to Isaac, but currently we do have restrictions on the size of those accessory structures and garages in our residential district. So I believe in our R1 and R2, they can only be 900 square feet for a detached garage, with the potential to go up to 1,300 square feet, I think, another 50% with a conditional use permit that requires that coming through a approval process. We do, I believe, allow or do not have restrictions on those types of building for agriculturally zoned properties, which are, we do still have some within the city limits that are some of the bigger, older rural farmstead type properties that do not have those restrictions. And then anything that's in our future growth area would be underneath the Carver County Planning and Zoning Authority currently, although we are working on trying to secure some of those parcels under the city's Planning and Zoning Authority, which I do also believe allows for that type of structure to be built or doesn't have restrictions on it. But we do restrict size, and I believe we do restrict materials in those residential districts so that you don't get the giant tin building in a R1 or R2 district. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's correct. And just as like for instance, you couldn't construct a detached garage that is exclusively built of metal, which I believe is kind of what you're highlighting, Mr. Chair, along with some other building material or general residential design requirements that are implemented throughout the code, which those are all standard items that staff looks at when we're receiving building permits that wouldn't necessarily go to the commission for a public hearing. So those are reviewed in our other residential districts.
I did look at this from my perspective, and I said, boy, there's a lot of detail that really has to go into this at the same time. And how do we get to that point?
Yeah, Chair Iverson, members of the commission, there certainly is a lot of information and a lot of detail, which is why we're trying to break it down and have some mini conversations on these different areas. I think there are some low-hanging fruit items, some of the cleanup and clarification that I envision staff will likely start marking up, and we'll bring those items to you as a commission and say, this is kind of what we think, and this provide consistency. But then there are certainly some of the broader, bigger picture items that this commission will be looked at to discuss and make some decisions. We'll certainly provide all of the research and comparables and things that you want to get, but there's a lot that's accurate.
Curious, developments that have been done in Victoria, like for example, this apartment, and any type of signage that's required, like a monument or a pylon or whatever, is an additional process required if it's developed all at one time? Would that be considered an accessory use?
Commissioner Moore, members of the commission, it's not considered an accessory use, I do not believe, but we do have a sign permitting process. So even in our residential developments, we will typically try to identify the areas. Sometimes those are carved off as little small outlots that the HOA maintains where those signs will go. But even then, they still do have to go through the sign permit process, which Isaac manages.
Hypothetically, if someone was, let's just say, traffic counts just went through the roof and a billboard company wanted to have the rights to build a billboard along Victoria Drive, would that be an accessory use?
Language says about billboards?
Commissioner Moore, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, so I believe since probably the early 1990s, most cities in the state of Minnesota have prohibited the installation of new billboard signs. That's the case in the city of Victoria, which is why you see just the one billboard along Highway 5 here that's been grandfathered in. There were some pushes in the 90s, and this is probably getting in the weeds of planning lore of cities trying to make sign holders remove billboards, which has been upheld, I believe. So really, there are no areas, to my knowledge, within the city of Victoria one could install a new sign, which is typically considered an accessory facility or a standalone item. Most cities that do permit them on city-owned properties or right away.
Okay, thanks for that history.
Yeah.
And Commissioner Moore, just to piggyback on that from my previous position in Burnsville, I know that they had a similar restriction on new billboards, and when Clear Channel wanted to install some digital billboards along 35, they ended up going through a entire ordinance change process, negotiating with the company. Eventually, they changed the ordinance that allowed them, but for every single face that was installed of a new billboard, they had to agree to take down 2 additional static billboards. So certainly the city could allow something like that if they chose to, but it would likely be a process because it is currently not allowed, as Isaac mentioned.
Thank you.
Christian?
My question kind of dives off a little bit. How difficult is it to change an R status? If I move into a neighborhood that's all R1, and let's say we have 6 acres of group or public area that we're maintaining, is there any way that we could change that to an R4?
Commissioner Pedersen, members of the commission, the city does have a rezoning process. This commission has seen that in instances with a development such as the Madeline Trail development, which was zoned as institutional. So as part of their development process, they requested a rezoning to R1 with their PUD. So there's certainly a process that, someone could come in and say, this parcel is currently zoned R1. We want to zone it R2 because this is what we want to do here. And that would be a process that would then be brought before this body and ultimately the city council to either approve or deny that rezoning.
Yeah, and it wasn't very difficult, and I know that that was more of an institutional to residential within a residential area. I think there should be some level of restriction, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, but I don't want to move into LMR or R1 and have an acre of property and then 10 years down the road across the street was R1, but now it's an R3, and I've got 4-story apartment buildings that I stare at across the street. Are there restrictions in place to stop that?
Yeah, Commissioner Pedersen, the other thing that comes into play is the city's comprehensive plan. So the comprehensive plan guides the land use for either low density, medium density, or high density development, and then those densities are defined. Low density is 2.25 to 6 units per acre, and then medium, and it goes up that way. So most of the areas that are, well, I shouldn't say most, all of the areas that are currently zoned R1 are identified as low density residential in the comp plan. So that provides some additional what's the word I'm looking for? It provides some additional protection of the type of item that can go in that land use. So you couldn't just come in and say, hey, I'm going to build an apartment in this R1. It also provides the Planning Commission and the City Council a means to deny that type of rezoning request. So if someone came in and said, I want to rezone this R1 parcel to R4 and build a big apartment unit, and it's guided as R1 in the comp plan, it gives some cover for the Planning Commission and Council to say no. But that certainly is an important document that provides some additional protection as well.
Gotcha. Is the comprehensive plan the only thing that guides what residential distinguishing numbers that we use at this point, or are there other guiding factors such as the county,
Yeah, well, in the comp plan, Commissioner Pedersen, members of the commission, the comp plan really is that guide plan. It's really the city's vision plan for the next 20 years, and that's updated on a decade basis. So every 10 years, that's updated and bumped another 10 years. But that includes, the Met Council input on what they want to see for affordability, for density. There are density minimums that the Met Council provides to cities that need to be worked into those comp plans, and ultimately the Met Council approves the comprehensive plan. So they make sure that the things that they want to see in there are in there. And I know some of you were involved, this is prior to my arrival, but were involved in the most recent update that took place in 2018, 2019, a lot of public feedback, stakeholders, that sort of thing. So it certainly takes in a number of input, a number of different types of input and other voices into account when looking at that. It takes current zoning into account, although current zoning doesn't necessarily mean that's what has to be the zoning in the comp plan. That can change. You know, it might be R1 today, but in 20 years, we'd like to see that be central business district, something like that, for an example. So you might see a change between what the current zone is versus what the land guide is in the future. But yeah, the comprehensive plan really is that document, and that's why you'll see it in our presentations when we're looking at new developments. We'll usually note what the land use guide has been and whether or not that development's going to meet that guiding.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm curious as to how some of those things can change, because it seems like it's pretty easy to change. And as for most plans, it's everything we knew up to yesterday. And if there's an R4 area that I decide to make an R1, how does that adversely affect? I use the R1 to R4, but how does an R4 to R1 adversely affect the plan, the Met Council, the county? And are there restrictions and guidelines we should have within the governing documents and city ordinances that make it a little bit more difficult to change? I don't know. Those are the only things that were coming to my mind when I was going through these.
Yeah, and I think I would just also note that, part of that is, I think, what this commission is charged with, right? You're taking all of that into account when you're seeing these proposals come forward. So a situation like the vacant property for Madeline Trail that was guided as institutional for a school. School district has said we don't want to build a school there. A group of peers, the planning commission, city council takes that into account. Does that make sense or does it not make sense? And similar with some of these other proposals that are out there. And again, a lot staff will try to head those off at the pass if things like that do come in and we just say it doesn't meet the comp plan, it doesn't meet zoning, we don't think this is going to be a good idea. But ultimately, it's an applicant's prerogative if they want to bring it before this body and give you an opportunity to weigh in. And, sure. And I think that's staff will provide the recommendations based on the comp plan and zoning. And but you're right, Commissioner Pedersen, that ultimately at the end of the day that this body and the city council can choose to change things. There's processes, and public feedback and public hearings and all kinds of things like announcements. They can be changed.
I guess the only other thing is maintaining the flavor of Victoria. It's an R1, R2 focused residential community right now, adding more R3 and R4. Whether it's through impervious surface or environmental limitations that we've tried to adopt with the tree ordinances and things like that. I guess I would like to see restrictions or things put in place to maintain the flavor of Victoria. That was, from a grand scheme of things, rather than have it turn into downtown Hopkins, use that as a poor example, but, for a different section that doesn't necessarily match what Victoria is today. And the environmental concerns of packing in more people into smaller densities, while I understand it hits other goals, how does it adversely affect the other pieces? And that's your job, and I know that's your job. But anything that we can put in place to help maintain the Victoria flavor would be something that I'd consider a beneficial aspect to any adjustments that would be made. That's all.
I'll just add a little bit of commentary on that. The 2040 comp plan, I mean, I think the city and the county worked really hard, and also the committee that was on that. I mean, they worked really hard in thinking about how each district impacted the other, and the areas where the medium and the high density future growth makes a lot of sense when you look at the plan. So on some level, it's like you got to kind of trust the process.
Commissioner Moore, members of the commission, just to piggyback on that, you'll see that much of the medium density, which is orange, and the higher density, which is brown, is there's not a lot of it, right? You'll see that it's still primarily low density residential being guided, but kind of envisioned in those areas around larger arterial roadways near some of the commercial type districts to try and provide some of that transition. And then I think, to your point, Commissioner Pedersen, things like the tree preservation ordinance, things like our berming and buffering requirements, things like impervious surface standards do help maintain some of that character. Did you have something to add?
I was going to say, Commissioner Pedersen, members of the commission, a good exercise for feedback that probably helps staff is if you're ever driving around in the city, and I know I do this. I don't know if Marty does it, but when I see things that I like in residential developments, I typically snap a picture of it and kind of pin it to the Pinterest board, so to speak. But if you're ever out about town and see those things, it'd be great to get that feedback or say, hey, we really like this, or we want to go this direction if you see something throughout the metro or elsewhere.
Very good. When I look at the process that the two of you have on this whole thing, my mentality would be to keep it very tight. Keep the not to the point of restrictive, but very, very tight restrictions. And I think we have, I think this planning commission, and I would hope that any commissions in the future would have the ability to make some good judgment on a variance for a individual situation. But my own observation is that if it's kept tight, it really does reflect that at the same time. And the looser it is, it always kind of spills over. So I think in terms of process, I think that mentality would be my recommendation. Just because of the amount of stuff that there is to cover, all of the areas, so.
Noted.
Any other thoughts on this?
I just have one baby one. So I brought up the detached garage in a common building. So perhaps it can be a variance, or perhaps it can be a conditional use. I think that's in my opinion, that's a better place to put that versus just a permitted accessory use. I think it needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case scenario, or just not allowed at all. I just don't, I get nervous about that. I just do. I think that's a wide open door for a lot of concern for me.
Commissioner Moore, members of the commission, staff's had the same observation across all of the zoning districts, that there may be some things that are currently listed as permitted uses that potentially should be conditional uses versus permitted. So certainly understand where you're coming from, and I think that'll be one of the things we'll want to nail down as we look at uses. A, are these the right uses? And B, should they be outright permitted or should they be conditional, and what are the pros and cons to each of those?
I mean, I hate to be so limiting to say you can't have a detached garage, right? But I mean, maybe there's a scenario where a concept that really makes a lot of sense. I don't know. Maybe there's a new development for seniors where they have fancy hot rod cars and they want like these fancy garages for their cars. Who knows?
Typically, they just want a garage so their garage car can be in it, but it doesn't drive, and that's why, on a cost basis, that's why they end up being accessory.
Right,
That is why it is.
right.
Commissioner,
But it could be a variance.
Because there's no
Very easily.
plumbing and, I mean, just like a little space heater kind of thing, or
Not even heated.
not even heated?
Just, I mean, it's just shelter.
members of the commission, I think what that code provision or that land use is referencing is some of those, and you don't see it a lot around here, but in the, I want to say late 80s, and this is before my time now, some of those apartment buildings that you'd see around where you'd have a central building and then a ring of connected garage stalls around it. I think development-wise, those just don't pop up anymore, so maybe it's a means to nudge people or developers towards having, let's say, underground parking or surface parking to some extent. But it is, I did spend some time thinking about that, and I was driving around where I live in northeast Minneapolis, and I saw one, and I was like, oh, that's probably what that's from.
It's usually with the cost of land, it kind of becomes
Right.
a tipping point.
Yes.
And I think, 30, 40, 50 years ago, the land was less expensive. It was easy to do. You didn't have the dig under cost, but you don't see it often in new development because the cost is too high. And so it's actually less expensive to dig and put an underground garage typically. If you don't have water table issues.
Greg, any other thoughts on that?
No, I'm just, was thinking through the detached garage. I mean, I can recall saying that in the, as Isaac points out, the coach home phase that was sort of like the townhouse development where you would present to the street a unified building with no large, almost dental-looking structures, and then, to the back, you would almost have a sort of a city kind of feel where there was almost like an alley, and then your detached garage was back there. I've seen that go both ways, where it's been really desirable. I've also seen it where, DEA agents have popped out of those garages to make drug busts in apartment buildings. So I share your concern there.
Very good. Any other thoughts on the topic? We certainly do have our work cut out for us, I think, to work through this. So this is step 2 of how many steps?
Probably 4 just for background, and then we'll really get into the weeds after that.
Well, I mean, this is a good, the exercise of this is, in my opinion, excellent, because it brings out a whole bunch of thoughts that are very, very, very real. So, hearing no other discussion, I will close this item, and I will move on to the miscellaneous section of our agenda. And Julie has a city council meeting coming up on 27th. And then Greg he gets kind of a bonus round on this. He has the meeting on the 11th, October 11th, which is also the joint workshop. I'm sure you will want to go through the workshops.
Yeah, Chair Iverson, members of the commission, we do have a second joint workshop that's been added since our last meeting. So you'll recall last meeting, we talked about the November 8th Urban Land Institute panel. That will be a joint workshop with the city council. We're also planning now on October 11th, 5:30 p.m. start a joint workshop to review the Downtown West Phase 1. So we believe that we are at a point now where we'll be able to have a preliminary development agreement, which, as you'll recall, is for a 125 to 145 unit market rate apartment, as well as some city improvements of Steiger Lake Lane, Central Green, stormwater facilities. So our intention, I think, would be to have the developer come into that workshop, provide some information, staff will provide some information, and then following that workshop, have the council consider a preliminary development agreement. Very early still, so this project will still go through the typical development steps, so there will be a more fully fledged concept plan that will come before preliminary plat, final plat, but a little bit of an added step because the city is the property owner of this parcel, so essentially getting that land quote unquote under contract before moving through those phases. So for those that are able to attend on the 11th at 5:30, we will welcome you. Otherwise, as always, they'll be recorded and live streamed and available to be watched at another date.
So one of the other things, as I was going through this on Sunday evening, is there any homework, assignment, any reference information that we can reference to, to figure out all of this?
Yeah, Commissioner Iverson, members of the commission, will be putting a background report together for the workshop, and that background report will be shared with you as well. So we do not have that compiled yet. We will in the next week or so, but we'll make sure that the commission is also given a copy of that workshop background that will have some of the background information prior to the meeting.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you. Commissioners, any other issues?
I just have a quick question. This developer, are they developing all of downtown West?
No, Commissioner Moore, members of the commission, this first phase is very much in line with the phase one that was identified in the Kimley Horn feasibility study.
Okay.
So the southeast corner of the property.
It's been a long time in coming. For sure. Well, if there is no other items, this will be one of our shorter meetings. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I'd like to make a motion that we adjourn.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, motion carries. Thank you very much. Thank you.